guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing a party prep with me. Recently I threw a little mini sort of bridal shower for one of my friends and I really wanted to walk you guys through the process, show you guys how I plan things out, share some recipes, some decorating ideas, and yeah, just show you guys all the details. Of course, I know for a lot of us, summer is starting to come to a close, school is starting to come back in season. However, I think a lot of the tips and tricks that I'll be showing you today are going to be very applicable to any season, any sort of occasion, whether that be a fall party, winter party, spring party, whatever it is that you have going. So I hope you get lots of inspiration today and get some ideas, some tips and tricks for any party planning that you have for this year. And if you're new, make sure that you subscribe down below for new home decor, DIY, and homemaking content every single week. I have a super fun fall decorating video coming next week that I'm so excited to share with you guys, so make sure you're subscribed and give the video a thumbs up if you learned something today, if there's something that you found inspiration from. But I believe that is everything. I'm going to show you guys kind of how I organize the party and kind of how I put all of my aesthetics and everything together, and then we'll get into some actual recipes and putting together the party. So when trying to put together my ideas and aesthetics for this party, I really wanted to put everything together in one spot, and I feel like there's so many different ways that you can do this. I decided to do it with a slideshow. So this is what I came up with. It is super simple. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing presentation in the world, but it was just a way for me to put all my ideas in one spot and also my recipes and things. So we did this party for my friend at Madison, so this is just the sort of title page just to sort of give it a name, and the next slide shows the digital invites that I sent out to all my friends that were coming. So if you've been on my channel for a while, you know that I love budget-friendly, high-end looks, and I feel like this party was no different. I really wanted to make it feel special, but sometimes if you're printing off a bunch of invites, it can get a little expensive, and we were also doing it really small, really low-key, so I just made a really simple invite. I found like a template off of Google that I just sort of built my ideas off of, and then I just put everything in the invitation, and then I just saved it as a JPEG and sent it to all the people that were coming. The next slide is the menu. I did a very small, low-key, very casual menu, and I absolutely love that I went with this because it made party prep so much simpler. There's definitely quite a few things I had to do in advance and sort of think through the order that I was going to do them in. So basically we did like a nighttime party, which was snacks and desserts. Super simple. I did a fresh little cake with strawberries. We did some fruit, guacamole, some crostinis, as well as a little drink. So super simple, very fresh and perfect for summer. And then in the next few slides, I sort of broke everything down into what I wanted to make. So this is the original recipe that I was going to do. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more later in this video. So it was really nice to be able to just copy and paste my link in there. I don't need to worry about trying to find it again. And then just any other details or anything that I find to be very important or just good to know as I'm making the recipe. Next up were the sides and the snacks. All of this was pretty straightforward. I just threw some pictures in there of the aesthetic or the feel that I was going for. And then there was a baguette recipe that I wanted to try, so I copied and pasted that in there, and just again, very simple. So I wanted to have a fun sort of pink drink for this party. Again, it really just depends on the aesthetic and the feel that you're going for. We did sort of a variation of this recipe, which by the way, I'll have any recipes that I used in this video linked below. So I have that link there. We did a little bit of a variation on it, and you could even make it non-alcoholic if you really wanted to, but again, just super simple and really fun. And then this next page is probably my favorite. I put together a bunch of pictures of the sort of feel that I was going for. I was sort of going for a garden party theme. I felt like that fit perfectly with the cake that I wanted to make. I also put that as part of the sort of mood board, and given that it's summertime, I just thought it would be perfect. The day of actually happened to be a very stormy day, so we ended up having to do it inside, but nonetheless I feel like this was really helpful in figuring out exactly what I wanted to do aesthetic wise, and that drink is actually basically how the drink ended up looking. I wanted to use mason jars and sort of go for a very casual garden party feel. And the last slide is probably the most helpful. If you are doing a presentation like this, or a presentation format I should say, have a slide for your grocery list. Especially since a couple of these recipes were recipes I'd never made before. There were a couple ingredients that I didn't really have on hand, so it was super helpful to have a list of everything that I needed. That way when I went to the store, I knew exactly what I was looking for, and there wasn't really anything that I forgot to pick up. So this really came in handy even if you're not doing this sort of format. Definitely make a grocery list as you go through all of your recipes and make sure that you have everything. So that is how I prepped and sort of planned everything out for the little party. I thought it was super helpful, and I definitely think it's a really good strategy or technique if you want to try it. But now that everything is planned out, we have a really good idea of how everything is going to look and play out. Let's start putting everything together. The first recipe we're going to be making is a gluten-free baguette recipe. Some of you guys may know that I have been gluten-free for almost a year now. So when I put together this crostini recipe, I really wanted to try to make a gluten-free bread option. As I mentioned before, I will have all recipes that I use in this video linked down below. That way if you want to try it out for yourself, you can definitely do so. I thought that this baguette recipe actually turned out pretty well. There were a couple things that I did wrong, which is where my next tip comes in. And I had the intention to do this, which is make it ahead to make sure that it was a good recipe, and time just got away from me. So if you're trying a new recipe, I would recommend, if you can, to try it before the day of the actual party, because there were a couple things that I did in this recipe that I would have done a little bit differently. So I made mine in a stand mixer just because I thought it would make the process a lot easier. You could probably make this dough by hand, but there were certain parts in the recipe where you needed to mix it on high speed just to get it to a certain consistency. Something that I'm not sure happened or not was whether I actually killed the yeast instead of allowing it to bloom properly. Maybe my water wasn't hot enough or something, but I really don't know because I made one other mistake that sort of affected the rising and how fluffy the actual bread was. So I put all the ingredients together and I mixed it with the paddle attachment until it made this really nice, smooth, slightly sticky dough. The next part of the recipe, which again the specifics are going to be in that link down below, was to let the dough rest in the fridge for a little while. I find that with even things like cookies and such, that refrigerating your dough is always a good idea, just to make sure all the ingredients sort of mesh together a little bit for the best result. Now that the dough is chilled, we can start making the shape of our baguettes. Something that this recipe called for that I didn't have on hand was tapioca starch. I'm not quite sure what it does for this recipe, but I did recommend using tapioca starch for rolling and kneading the dough instead of maybe just using a gluten-free flour mix that has all kinds of things in it, such as xanthan gum, rice flour, and many other different gluten-free flours. Once I kneaded it together for a while, it was time to split it into 2 loaves. So I just used a bench scraper to cut it in half into 2 somewhat equal pieces. The next part of the recipe was to roll it into its shape. And if you're familiar with baguettes, they are usually a little bit thicker in the middle, and then they sort of taper on the ends to be a little bit thinner. So once I did that to one, I set that to the side and then repeated on the next one. And make sure that you have plenty of the tapioca starch just to make sure that it's not going to stick to your counter, because this dough is a little bit sticky. So this next part is where I think I messed up. You are actually supposed to score the dough after it rises. So I'm not sure if me scoring the dough all over the top hindered how well the dough rose while it rested, but it does say that in the recipe. I just must have missed it. And now I'm going to put it on the baking sheet that I plan on baking these with, and we're going to let it rest in a warm place. My dough did rise a little bit, but I think it would have rose a lot better had I not scored it so soon as well as deeply. You may be able to see that I actually scored like halfway through it, so I would recommend maybe not doing that. And the night actually got super busy for me, so my mom ended up baking it. So all the baking instructions are going to be in the recipe below. The next thing that we need to bake for the party is a cake. My initial idea was to make a gluten-free angel food cake, and I'll have that recipe down below. However, I think I didn't whip the egg whites as much as I should have. So we ended up just making a gluten-free sort of yellow, very basic vanilla cake that I'll also have linked down below. If you don't want something very temperamental and super easy to make, I feel like that would be a really good option. But nonetheless, we're going to start out this recipe by separating our yolk and egg whites. If you aren't gluten-free, I feel like you could make this sort of recipe and it would be a little bit less temperamental. But like I said, I did end up making a super easy, simple one. Or you could even use box cake mix if that's something that you would like to try. So once the egg whites are separated, we are going to put in the cream of tartar, and we're going to start start whipping our egg whites. If you're not familiar with Angel food cake, it is a very fluffy, spongy cake. So whipping the egg whites is key to getting that fluffy texture. Once it got to a foamy consistency, I added in the sugar and powdered sugar, and I just put it through a sieve just to make sure it was nice and fine and there weren't going to be any clumps. And then I also added in some vanilla extract and started whipping again. And again, this is where I think I didn't whip it enough. The recipe says to get it to soft peaks, but I think I should have whisked it for maybe a couple minutes more, just so when I lifted the beaters, they sort of stayed in that peak a little bit better. Once you get more stiff peaks, you're going to add in your dry ingredients that I just sifted together in a separate bowl. And there really aren't that many dry ingredients because it's the egg whites that really make this fluffy. Another thing I found interesting about this recipe was the fact that there was no baking soda or baking powder or anything to make it rise. So if I were to make this again, I would maybe try to experiment and add in a little bit of one of those, because the main thing with mine was that they didn't really rise. They tasted okay, but they really stayed the same height and it really wasn't the effect that I was going for. So I halved my recipe because the original recipe made a full bundt pan and I knew that I wanted a really small one. So I used two 6-inch cake pans. I lined them with parchment paper and sprayed them really well to make sure that there was going to be no sticking. And the recipe said to run a knife through it and just sort of swirl it around. So that's what I did, and I baked it according to the instructions, and this is basically how it turned out. Like I said, it wasn't bad, but it definitely was a bit dense and it really didn't rise that much. It definitely was a very pretty white color, but in the end, my sister ended up making me another batch of cakes, but this time we made a very simple gluten-free vanilla cake that I'll have linked for you. Now that the cakes are baked, it's time to start getting together our decorations. I wanted it to feel super fresh, super simple, and to go with that sort of pink color scheme, I wanted to do some strawberries on top. I just feel like this looks super elegant. Most people really love strawberries, and I just love the color that it added to a very beige cake. And as you can see, we're cutting up most of them, but I did leave a few whole to sort of make a very aesthetic, very pretty arrangement on the top. And I'll sort of show you what I mean when we get to decorating. And off camera, I did make a really simple vanilla buttercream. I can have a recipe linked down below. Putting this cake together probably took me maybe 10 minutes. It's super easy. And I chilled the cakes for a little while before the party and put everything together shortly before it started, just to make sure everything was cooled off and ready to go. So I put my first cake right side up, and then I just put a really thin layer of the buttercream on top. I smoothed it out quite a bit, but I also kept it super rustic looking because I wasn't trying to make it look very perfect. And now we're taking a bunch of those cut up strawberries and layering it on top of the buttercream. And once we have a nice even layer, we are going to place the second layer on top, but we are going to put it face down so we have a nice flat surface on top. I wanted a very true naked cake sort of feel for this cake. So of course you could put icing all over the side, but I ended up just doing basically the same steps on the top, except the only thing that was different was I started with the whole strawberries as sort of the focal point on top and just sort of leaned those together in the middle, and then added as many of the cut up strawberries that I saw fit all around the strawberries just to sort of finish off the look. And that was basically it. This was a super simple, delicious cake. It was really fluffy, it was moist, it looked so elegant, and it really didn't take that much effort to put together, which I really loved. So now we are going to make the guacamole. I make a super simple guacamole with just a few add-ins that make it a little bit more flavorful. So I'm going to start with a bunch of ripe avocados, and I'm just going to take the pit out of those, put them in a bowl. I'm going to mash those up and also add a good amount of the lime juice. I usually do just a couple tablespoons. One thing about me and cooking is I feel like I don't really have a solid recipe for everything that I make. I'm one of those people who definitely just eyeballs things, and for the most part everything that I make turns out pretty much the same. But I'll do my best to give you guys measurements in this video, that way if you want to recreate it you definitely can. Next I'm going to be using half of a large red onion. I love red onion because it adds a little bit of color, and it's also not nearly as strong as a yellow onion, and I'm going to dice that up pretty fine, that way it's not too big in our guacamole. So I'm going to mix that in and also add a bunch of salt and pepper to taste. Having enough salt in guacamole I think is key to a really good guacamole, and usually we use fresh tomatoes from our garden, but we only had a few tomatoes, so a shortcut that I will sometimes do is add in a couple scoops of salsa, and I'm also going to add a bunch of fresh cilantro. I'm gonna chop that up and mix that into our guacamole as well. And off camera I did add in some other seasonings such as paprika, chili powder, and cumin. Also a bit of garlic, and that is basically it. To plate it up for a very easy party snack, I am just going to put the bowl on a plate and fill in with a bunch of tortilla chips all around it. You could do pita chips, you could do different veggies, you could do lots of different crackers. This could be part of a type of charcuterie board, but it's just a really good party recipe. Now to set up, like I said, we did end up having this party inside. It was super gloomy outside, so I just dressed up the table with a tablecloth, a runner, as well as some flowers. I cut my baguettes in half and buttered the inside of all of them, and I cut them into little crostini shapes. I did this ahead of time and just sort of had them ready to go before all my guests got there. And once my guests got there, I did start putting them together just because this is more of a warm dish. I did want it to be nice and fresh. So now we're just gonna lightly oil a pan, and we are going to pan fry the crostini on both sides. And we want them to get nice and crisp and golden brown. And of course you can do this with any type of bread or baguette or French bread. It's going to look something like this, and they're going to be nice and hot and toasted. We're going to top it with a little bit of pesto, some cut up fresh mozzarella, as well as some cherry tomatoes. And this is just so simple, and it just adds to the whole aesthetic. I really love staggering all the different dishes down at the centerpiece. I put some fresh flowers in the middle, as well as a mini charcuterie board with some fruit. I got some really inexpensive paper plates and napkins from Hobby Lobby, and this cute little pink drink with the lemon on the mason jar. And overall this turned out so well. I love that I was able to use a lot of the things I already had, and overall it was just such a fun time getting to catch up with my friends and celebrate my friend who's getting married in just over a month now. Alright you guys, that is going to wrap up today's party prep video. I really hope you enjoyed it and got some ideas for yourself. Even though the day turned out super rainy and we weren't able to do the party outside, I feel like we made the most of it, and that's probably one of my biggest tips when it comes to party planning or hosting, is just being as laid back as possible and just really try to deal with problems as they come. I'm definitely not perfect at this. I wasn't perfect at it the day of, but it's just something to keep in mind, because all that really matters is that all the people that you want are there and that everyone has a good time. Especially for someone like me, like all my friends, we have a very different schedules. It can be really hard for all of us to get together, so just the fact that we were able to spend some time together was of course very special, so that was all that really mattered. But the recipes turned out pretty well, and it was just a really fun time. So if you like the video, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you have any tips for hosting, party planning, or anything like that, make sure you leave them down below. I definitely am not an expert. And make sure that you subscribe for more home decor, homemaking, and DIY content every single week on my channel. Again, that fall decorating video is coming next week, and it is crazy. I am so excited. But anyway, thank you for spending some time with me over on my channel today. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day so far, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.